Hi there. This is a quick video that is going to teach you a trick in Premiere to get an output out whenever you're having trouble and you're on a time crunch. Oftentimes I see people in the forums saying, hey, I'm having trouble with my timeline. I'm trying to export. I'm getting some kind of render error or it's slowing down and I'm on a deadline and I have to get this project out the door. And basically what this is it's taking advantage of something called smart rendering in Premiere. What this means is if the rendering codec in your sequence, if you go into the preview settings inside of your sequence settings, you can go in and actually set that to a format that's good enough to output something like ProRes 422, ProRes 422 HQ. And by setting it to something like that, there's another setting in the output options that lets you go in and use previews. You can actually use the render files that give you the green bar at the top of your timeline, and it will just collect those files into the frames of video in those files. It'll collect them into a new QuickTime file for export. And so this has two effects. First off, it lets you render as you go. It also can help troubleshoot out if you have one particular problem. Like, for example, you're trying to export out your sequence and it's always failing at about the 3-minute mark. You can start to look and see and take apart what is going on at that 3-minute mark that might be having a problem. It could be a particular file that's corrupted. It could be a plugin that's being used or a filter that's being used on a particular file that's just having some difficulty rendering. But lastly, it also is typically faster because you're kind of rendering as you go using this method. But at any point in the process, you can switch over and use this method. So if you've got an hour to get a project out the door, it has to be posted at a certain time. This is a good technique to learn. Basically, what I'm going to do here to start is I've already got my sequence set up here. This is the edit that we're trying to export. And what I'm going to do first is go to my sequence settings. And down here in the bottom where it says video preview, I want to make sure and set this for the output format that I want to be able to create basically like a mezzanine file, like a final good enough quality output file that I could then transcode and turn into something like an MP4 if I need it. So in this case, I'm actually going to go a little step higher than ProRes 422. We're going to go to ProRes 422 HQ. 4444 is also an option if you need it, but I find 422 HQ is usually about where I need my files. So I'm going to go ahead and set that. When I click OK, if I had any green barred areas on the timeline already, it has to delete those. It has to get rid of them. So you may get a message at this point saying, hey, your previews are going to get blown away. That's fine. We don't want those previews used in the final output anyway. Now, once I have this format set up, what I'm going to do is actually start to render this sequence. And what I like to do is do it in maybe about 4 or 5 minute chunks. I'm just going to hit the Out key here to select this first part of the timeline. And I'll go ahead and go to Sequence, Render Into Out. And by doing this, what Premiere is doing is it's actually taking this segment of the timeline and it's making ProRes 422 HQ frames, but it's storing those in a preview location. So basically when you play back that segment of the timeline, it's actually going to be playing those ProRes 422 frames, not playing the actual clips in the timeline. It's in a way, it's like a temporary flatten where it's flattening everything down that's within that segment. Now, let's look back at the timeline. This is completed. If everything looks good at this point, you've got the green bar over this first section. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and mark my in point and mark another out point. And I'm going to do the exact same thing. Now, I could do this all in one step, but you're probably watching this video because somewhere the output, when you're trying to export the video, it's creating a problem. And so the idea with this is I want to try and do this in steps and see if there's any way or any part of my sequence that's causing it to kind of hang up. That gives me some idea of where to kind of focus my attention to try and fix the problem, maybe by turning off a color effect or a third-party plugin or something like that, just to get something out the door. All right. So the last step here, I'm going to go ahead and do this one more time. Again, I'll just mark the endpoint. And in this case, I'm actually just going to go all the way to the end here. and mark the out point and do the same thing. So the idea behind this is you're basically rendering the timeline. You can do this at any point in the process. In fact, for a lot of long form projects, we've seen people actually go in and do this render into out as they're going along, so that you already have a green bar over big chunks of the timeline. And it's very, very easy to then do the final step of exporting in that identical format. So once this finishes up here, we just have another second or so. There we go. What we're going to do now, we've got the green bar going across the entire length of the timeline. I'll go ahead and do an Alt-X here to just clear my in and out points. And now I'm going to go to the Export tab. Now, the important thing in the export, in order to take advantage of those preview frames, two things need to happen. The first thing is we need to match our export preset to the same identical format. If I'm rendering to ProRes 422HQ in the timeline, and then I go to export out a DNX file, well, guess what? It's going to ignore the previews typically, and it's just going to start rendering straight to DNX. It doesn't do the smart rendering that we're trying to accomplish here. So what I want to try and do here is I'm going to go into my presets, and I'm just going to pick the factory preset here for Apple ProRes 422HQ. This should give me a QuickTime file. I can come in here to these different settings to just verify, but typically you want everything set to match source. The frame size has to be the same. The frame rate has to be the same as your sequence. The last thing that I'm going to do is down in the General tab, I need to make sure and turn on this Use Previews function. By doing this, I'm telling Premiere it's okay if the formats match to just copy those preview frames and stick them in the final output file. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and render this out of Premiere. Now, you should see the render speed should be considerably faster, because all Premiere has to do at this point is copy those frames over into the new file. So as fast as Premiere can do a copy action, since we rendered as we went, this gives me the ability to just very, very quickly copy. I can see it's already finished copying in the time I'm talking here. So this is sort of my technique for just making absolutely certain I can hit a deadline to export out a file. I hope this helps. Leave a comment if you need any additional clarification on anything I'm talking about here. Usually this works best with mezzanine file formats like DNX or like ProRes. I kind of prefer ProRes because it's infinitely flexible as far as frame rate and frame size. But you know, your mileage may vary. Just make sure, again, sequence settings, that preview codec needs to match what your output is going to be. Then you can use previews and you can get all the benefits. Thanks for watching.